Um, so this is an update on developments in numbers over the past year since the same talk at EAMS 2020. While I was trying to think what I'd done, I thought I really haven't done that much this year. I've mainly been supporting all the extra online assessment that we've been doing. And then I looked back over our development blog and there's absolutely tons. It feels like the past decade's worth of development. So yeah, there's quite a lot, and frankly, I'm tired. So here's what's happened in the last year. First of all, localization has continued. A few people have helped to translate into Indonesian. So thanks to them, and thanks to everybody else who's kept the other translations up to date. On the Math Center editor, we have just under 1,000 more users. I've counted people who've created a question of their own as users from roughly 200 more institutions, counting domain names and email addresses, and just over 2,000 more questions published for everybody to use, which is really good to see that there's more and more material for you to reuse. So development, I'll just get into it, and I don't think I've put these slides in any particular order, maybe date order. The GeoGebra extension I rewrote completely with the aim of making it easier to use just as it was, and then also adding some new features. So you can now query stuff out of a GeoGebra worksheet as part of your marking algorithm for a part, which means you can set up a question where the only interaction is a GeoGebra worksheet and then do some marking based on that. Here's a very simple example from a question where you just had to move a point to a particular position. So it gets the position out and then checks it's exactly equal to the target. You could do more complicated stuff. You can also create a GeoGebra worksheet from scratch using JME functions. So now the function that loads an applet, you can give it a list of objects to create, and those can be defined in terms of each other, which might help making randomized diagrams rather than having to go off to geogebra.org and draw the thing yourself. I took some time to do roughly the similar things to the JSX graph extension because there are cases where that's preferable. It's certainly much lighter than GeoGebra. It's not an external dependency. GeoGebra has this language called Jessie code for creating diagrams. The idea is it involves a bit less work than writing JavaScript, which I approve of. So here's a script which produces a diagram of, looks like a triangle and then 3 kinds of center. And then this stuff in those brackets is like giving a load of options to each of the objects. So there's that. In the course of supporting people using numbers, I've written a few other extensions. There's a one for downloading a text file. So we have quite a few assessments this year, particularly in statistics, where we generate a large data set and then we want the students to download it and do some analysis on it in R or SPSS, whatever they're being told to use. So this extension, you give it a list of data and it will produce a plain text file if you like, or a CSV file. It makes all that quite easy. Getting dynamically created files to download is quite tricky, so it does all of the complicated bits. You don't have to remember how to do that in JavaScript. A nice little extension which will take a number variable and write it out in words for you. I think somebody working at secondary or primary level asked for that. And then in the random person extension, I only had a data set for England and Wales. I've found data on name frequencies from the USA and France, so I've added those in, and now there's a framework for adding in more data for other countries. So that should make it more widely usable. Just a couple of changes to JME syntaxes. Actually, there's something else a bit later on, but somebody asked for the ability to do chain relations, like say A less than B less than C, and that is equivalent to the expression A is less than B and B is less than C. So a little convenience there. I think the idea for that was for students to write that as their answer to a mathematical expression part. That's good. And this feature I thought had been in for about 5 years, and that just says how long 2020 was. When you're defining a variable, you can, if you give a few names separated by commas and the value produced is a list, it will destructure that list. So A will be the first element in the list, B the second, C the third. And I've used that quite a lot. For one thing, it makes generating a few distinct values quite easy. Here I shuffle the numbers 1 to 9 and take the first 3 out of the shuffled list. So those are guaranteed to be different from each other. So be aware of those are quite useful. I did a bit of work on the theme and extension editors. So you can now create your own theme or your own extension entirely from scratch within the web-based editor. The theme editor will get you started by saying build off the default theme, and then you get a CSS file for just changing how it looks. It now uses CSS variables, which means you just change one line in the script to like change the background color or the font or the size of text. So that should be easier. And based on the number of custom themes that there are now, I think that's been successful. Something that we make available to all our students, just for as long as they're here, but particularly we point them towards in their first weeks in stage 1, is a getting started test. That the idea was to show them how numbers work, like how to enter their answers, what the syntax is. I took a look at it a few months ago and realized we hadn't changed it since we first used numbers 10 years ago. So I've written a new one using the menu mode, so I can choose which bits to go into here, and then there's an explore mode question, test yourself, which will go through all the different things you've been shown. So we've got something, first of all, a bit about accessibility, and so the display options, I'll get onto that in a bit, some stuff, and then some basic stuff on just the general idea of how numbers works. To set student expectations, I think there was something yesterday about digital literacy, about how does automatic marking work, how important is syntax, that kind of thing. And there's some other stuff on entering answers. I think mathematical expressions and numbers are stuff we have the most trouble with. So that's published. If you look at these slides, that is a link to go to that getting started test. You can use that if you want. My big goal for this year, in between fighting fires and supporting everybody else who's using numbers in practice, is to it was to implement diagnostic testing. We've had a system called Diagnosis in use at Newcastle, and I think it's used in a few other institutions, which was about 30 years old, I think. It was a Windows 3 program. And the idea was it has a graph of knowledge topics that it wants to assess students on. They're all linked to each other. Basically, you need to know how to add 2 fractions before you can, you need to know how to find a common denominator before you can add 2 fractions, that kind of thing. And the clever bit about it is that it tries to reduce the number of questions it asks the student. If you show that you can do something, then it assumes that you can do all the stuff that it depends on. Or if you get a question wrong, it says, well, you can't do any of the stuff that leads on from that, and starts asking easier questions to work out what you can do and pinpoint exactly what you're missing. Diagnostic testing is not a new topic, but I wanted to have it available in numbers, and particularly I wanted to re-implement diagnosis so that we can stop using this old Windows program. I've been partially successful this year. I've re-implemented diagnosis. We might test it on students next year, but I've reached a point in the design where I need a bit of help. And I'm doing a 10-minute lightning talk tomorrow morning, so there'll be more on that in a bit. Another change for JME, the physicists and the engineers and all the people who aren't in the maths department use different constants to us depending on what they're doing. A very common request was to use J instead of I for the imaginary unit. Actually, in a group theory course I came up with, we wanted to use E for an empty word and pi for a particular permutation. So the built-in values of constants were limiting in those cases. So you can now turn the built-in constants on or off and define your own ones. So in this screenshot, which isn't very big, I've defined J as the imaginary unit. So whenever you have a complex number, it will use J. I've just defined some standard basis vectors, which you can use both when displaying randomized values, and students can use in their answers to mathematical expression parts. And then I've chucked in a couple more here. Tau for 2 pi, and H bar, which the physicists wanted. That was the thing that really prompted me to implement this finally. So those are accessible everywhere that JME syntax is used, in variable definitions, in displaying randomized expressions, and in students' answers. And I haven't got a screenshot of it, but the JME syntax can be made case sensitive for students' answers, which was a bad design decision 10 years ago. So now you can insist that like capital A isn't the same as lowercase a in a student's answer, which often is important. While implementing diagnostic testing, I realized that, and in fact, diagnostic testing wasn't the only use of it. The idea is that you can write a script which is in charge of choosing which questions to show to the student. And another model that I wanted to implement with that is a kind of mastery course where you have to get everything right within a topic before you move on. I'm not saying that I would ever do that in teaching, but that's a common model, and I wanted to see if it was possible. And what I found was that I wanted to ask the student basically the same question a few times, but increasing the difficulty level or making sure that I cover certain like edge cases. And rather than copying a question a lot of times and changing a little bit, I really wanted to be able to set the value of a variable for each time that question was used. So you can do that now. You can mark a variable as one that can be overridden by the exam. And in the exam editor, when you add a question, you can set a value for a variable, or I mean, that could be any kind of expression. So I could say, the first time I use it, pick a random small number. The second time I use it, pick a random big number. I think there's an example on the numbers blog of using this for a stats question, computing the median, where you want to maybe give them different versions which will pick out different mistakes that students are likely to make. As ever, I've worked a bit more on accessibility. I found some people in Canada very kindly did an accessibility review of numbers, but didn't tell me about it, so it only appeared when I searched for something else. But working through that, they had some good suggestions. One was that there should be an accessibility guide for students, like really laying out how the interface works, what to expect, which is particularly useful for screen reader users, because it's hard to get a picture of, get an impression of the whole interface. So that now exists. That's a link to something in the documentation. And then again, there were more little changes. I've tried with more screen readers. I've noticed stuff that needed changing. More stuff gets read out. So now it's, I think, much better, and I'm much happier with it. Hopefully, within the next year, I'll run some proper user testing sessions with a variety of participants. I'm hoping to recruit from across Newcastle, potentially outside, to really pick up remaining accessibility problems. One thing that came up this year, while I've always been fairly happy that because Numbers runs in a web browser, you can zoom in and out and do stuff like that. We had a student who asked to change the background color of the page, which is completely reasonable. It's a common accessibility request that we get from the Disability Office. So there's now a button in the Numbers interface called Display Options, which gives you these options to change the background color, the text color if you want, and change the size of text, which you might want to do if you just want text to be a bit bigger but not scale the rest of the interface. I'm not exactly sure what the interaction between those two is, but people do ask for it. So it's there. And after implementing this, we had our exam period, and we got a few emails from students saying how much they appreciated it. So these students had been just getting on, not making a fuss, but really benefited from this change. So I'm glad that I did that. And I think that's an important point, that students might not even know what to ask for, or might not know that they can ask for stuff. So it's worth implementing these things, even if you feel like nobody needs it. Right, so I think that was that's the Numbers runtime stuff. There's been a fair bit of development on the LTI tool as well. We've had so much more Numbers use at Newcastle, and particularly more summative use, which has prompted a few developments in the LTI tool. Something for my own benefit as an administrator is this new dashboard page. We can see all the tests that are being accessed in the past 24 hours, which helps us get to something we're looking for. But also, if we want to do an upgrade and we see that there's a big test going on, maybe hold off. We're not always aware of everything that's happening across the university. That screenshot is just from today. It looks like there's an enrichment event happening. So that's good to see. And there's a global search box, which makes it way easier to answer student queries. Often a student will email us and say, why is my Numbers test not working? And then give no information beyond that. And we used to have to work out which course they're in, which modules they're doing, which ones that might have a Numbers test going on at the moment. So now you can type in a student's name, or the name of a course, or the name of a particular assessment, and find it straight from the admin interface, which has saved us loads of time. I haven't got a screenshot of it, but once you've found a user, if you click on their name, you can see all of the attempts that they've made recently. You can see which things they've launched and see what browser they're using, which has helped us loads with working out browser compatibility issues. And when a student says, I did this test and they had a problem there, we can tell them, oh no, we can see that they only accessed it 5 minutes before the deadline, and of course it was going to end. So that's, I think, a really good feature. So again, with so much more assessment using Numbers, we've encountered a lot more cases where we've deployed a test, students have started using it, and then we've found there's a problem. So you have to make a change to the test. So now when you update the exam package in the LTI tool, there's a button just to update straight from the editor without having to go off and get the zip and upload it again, which is very good. There's a link to edit the exam, which again, as administrators, we find useful because we don't always know, we don't always have access to exams that a colleague writes immediately. And you can see all the versions of an exam package that there have been. So if you make a mistake, you can go back to a previous one. You can see who's stuck on an old version. And that, I think, means it's less high stakes. Updating a package, you can always go back safely. It helps to pinpoint bugs as well. Right. And something that we've used lots is automatic remarking. So once you've made a change to a test, maybe the test's already finished, or it's ongoing and some students have already used the broken version, this screen lets you automatically remark all of the student attempts, which was quite hard to arrange because numbers runs entirely in the client. The marking happens on the student's device. So what this does, it loads the numbers runtime without a display. And then for each attempt, it loads in that attempt's data. Everything gets resubmitted that was submitted, and then it reports a new mark, which we've had to use quite a few times, it turns out. That's really saved us a lot of work this year. One thing that I'm not sure if students are doing this more, or if students are more likely to do this year, or we just have so many more assessments it comes up more, is they're not pressing the submit button to submit their answers. And we've had a lot of back and forth about can numbers automatically mark answers that a student hasn't submitted, but with things like adaptive marking and particularly the explore mode, that would potentially cause problems that could lose a student more marks than it gains them. So we're still not sure about it. But anyway, on this auto remark screen, you can tick a box to try using answers that students haven't submitted, but those are saved in the LTI tool still. And that gets them a few marks, and that's saved a few students passing or failing a course. They are told to submit, and it gives them big warning boxes, but everyone knows it's very easy to ignore warning boxes and to ignore instructions. Right. I think this might be my last thing for the LTI tool. We have, again, with more and more use, we have had to spend a lot of time setting up extra time for students who require it. What we were doing was setting up a separate copy of the exam where the duration allowed was different. Now, within the LTI tool, you can set up an access change for a student. You can change the availability dates or extend the duration by either percentage or a number of minutes, and then apply those to a list of named users. So when a student opens the resource, if an access change applies to them, they just get that extension automatically, which will save us a lot of work, I think, and we'll only have one copy of an exam. Right, nearly at the end. Finally, setting up the LTI provider is fairly involved, particularly if you're not used to setting up web server stuff in Linux. So we've set up a Docker recipe to run inside containers. The idea with that is that you just, once you have Docker installed, you just run one command and it does all the stuff, and it's a self-contained, frozen package, which just runs. So that should make running the Numbers LTI provider a lot easier. And again, if you click through my links, click through to my slides from the Moodle site, that's a link that's in the LTI providers documentation. I think it's now the recommended installation method. Right, last of all, I had this slide last year. I thought, surely having done all that work this year that I showed at the start, there'd be fewer open issues on GitHub, but there are more than ever. I think they've roughly doubled. So So there's still loads more stuff to do. I think these are all little things now. I don't have a big goal in mind for the next year. But again, help is very welcome. I always have a few of these good first issue things that are quite easy to get on with if you want to get started. I'm very happy to offer support to anybody who wants to help with numbers development. And I think that's it. So I'll stop there for see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Christian. So I've just put the link again in the chat there to the questions area on Moodle. So start off with a couple here. Christian, just asking for an overview of numbers versus stack and sort of compatibility with other VLEs. Would you like to just give that sort of high level overview maybe for people new to the system?
Right. So maybe this is from a Stack user. I don't know. Stack is a plugin for Moodle. So it needs to run within a Moodle server. I think what Chris has been doing, I think what other Stack places have been doing is Moodle can expose itself as an LTI provider into other tools. So I think at Edinburgh they have Blackboard, and there's students get a link which goes straight into the Moodle, which shows a Stack quiz. What Numbers does is it produces self-contained SCORM packages, which are just zip files. Some learning environments have a SCORM player built in. I think Moodle's is the only one that I would really consider using. But then there's a separate Numbers LTI tool, which you can run on a server locally, and basically every learning environment now supports LTI. So I think effectively they're sort of similar. You have to run your own, well, if you're going to use LTI, you have to run your own server. And I think if you're doing that, then it's the same set of learning environments that is supported. But the benefit of the Numbers design is the test can just run completely standalone if you're not keeping track of scores, or if you only have a SCORM player, then that works and it will save the data for you. And that if the VLE has a SCORM player built in, that means you don't have to run any extra servers.
Thanks, Christian. So on that topic, just on the chat there, which LTI version does Numbers support? There was a question there.
At the moment, it's 1.1. I think over the next year, I want to get some of the newer features from 1.3 in, particularly getting the list of students out of the learning environment straight into Numbers rather than having to wait for the students to open the test. But they're, as far as I know, they're all, one is a superset of the other. So it's adding individual features on top.
Okay, thanks, Christian. I think we'll stop there because